The first thing Callum Vance noticed was the silence. Not the kind that settles in an empty room, but something heavier. A silence that felt deliberate, like the building itself was holding its breath. The KFC distribution center loomed ahead, a massive, windowless structure bathed in the sickly glow of the parking lot's dim security lights. There was no wind, no cars passing by, just the faint buzzing of flickering fluorescents. Something about the place felt wrong. As Callum stepped inside, the air turned stale, thick with the scent of raw meat and industrial cleaner. The floor was smooth concrete, stained in places with dark patches that didn't quite wash out. The overhead lights hummed, some flickering erratically, as if struggling to stay awake. Then there was Mr. Aldrich. The shift supervisor stood motionless near the entrance, a wiry man in his late 50s, dressed in an old uniform that looked as if it had never been washed. His eyes didn't blink, not once. He simply stared at Callum, his expression unreadable, his face a little too pale. Callum Vance. It wasn't a question. Callum swallowed, nodded. Something about the way Aldrich said his name made the hairs on his arms rise. Without another word, Mr. Aldrich reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled, yellowed sheet of paper. The edges were curled, the ink smudged in places as if it had been handled by dozens of trembling hands before his. He held it out. Read, memorize. Callum hesitated before taking it, the paper oddly warm to the touch. His eyes flicked over the list, confusion settling in as he read. Rule number 1. Never look at the delivery workers. If you do, look away immediately. Rule number 2. If you hear whispering from the meat locker, leave. Do not answer. Do not investigate. Rule number 3. At exactly 3:12 a.m., stop moving, no matter what happens. Rule number 4. If a coworker disappears, forget them. A slow, uneasy chill crept down Callum's spine. His fingers tightened around the page. Was this a joke? He looked up, expecting Mr. Aldrich to smirk, to say something about hazing the new guy, but the man's face was expressionless. These aren't suggestions, Aldrich said, voice flat. They're the only reason you'll survive your shift. Before Callum could respond, a voice cut through the quiet. Just follow the damn rules, kid. Callum turned toward the speaker, a woman standing near the inventory shelves, arms crossed. Ramona Goss. Her uniform was worn, her tired eyes dark with something Callum couldn't quite place. Fear? Exhaustion? You're acting like this is normal, Callum said, laughing nervously. Ramona didn't laugh. Because it is. A door creaked open somewhere deeper in the warehouse. A chill gust of air blew in from the refrigerated storage area. Jude Holloway, another night shift worker, strolled past with a cocky grin, snatching the paper from Callum's hands. He scanned the rules, snorting. This some kind of hazing thing? He crumpled the sheet. What happens if I break one? A ghost gonna get me? Ramona didn't move. You won't be laughing later. Jude rolled his eyes and shoved the paper back into Callum's hands before heading toward the back of the warehouse. The shift officially started. The place only got stranger as the hours passed. Callum couldn't shake the feeling that the walls were breathing. Not in a literal way, but the air seemed to shift, to pulse ever so slightly, like something was alive inside. The storage room door never fully closed, the small gap revealing the darkness beyond, and every time Callum passed it, he swore he could hear something faint, almost like a heartbeat. Then, at 1:37 a.m., the whispering started. Callum had just finished moving a crate when he heard it. A voice, muffled, soft, coming from the storage room. Hello? Anyone out there? He froze. The voice was too familiar. It was Jude. Callum turned slowly. The storage door was cracked open, revealing only darkness and the faint glint of metal shelving. Jude had gone into the back earlier, but he hadn't come out. At least, Callum didn't remember seeing him leave. He glanced toward Ramona, who had stopped working entirely, her face suddenly pale. Don't, she whispered. Callum swallowed. What do you mean, don't? He's in there? He's not, she snapped, eyes locked on the door. Jude is gone. A wave of nausea rolled through Callum's stomach. That didn't make sense. Another whisper from the dark. Guys, it's cold in here. Help me. Callum stepped toward the door. Ramona grabbed his arm, fingers like iron. Listen to me, she hissed. That's not Jude. Callum yanked his arm free, staring at her in disbelief. You're saying I should just ignore him? What if he's trapped? Something scratched against the floor inside the storage room. Callum's breath hitched. Not footsteps, not movement, something dragging. Then another voice joined in. His own. Callum, it's me. You have to come inside. His entire body went cold. That was his voice. Exactly, like a recording, a perfect copy. Ramona grabbed his wrist and yanked him back just as the storage door creaked open a little wider. The air from inside smelled wrong. Raw, wet, metallic. Callum's heart slammed against his ribs. From the darkness, something moved. Just a shift of shadow, a flicker of something pale beneath the shelves. Then, a hand, too long, fingers stiff, crawled into view. It was Jude's hand, but it wasn't attached to anything. Callum's stomach turned. He stumbled back, heart hammering as a soft, dragging noise scraped closer. Ramona whispered, "Close the door." Callum didn't hesitate. He shoved the door shut and slammed the bolt into place. The whispering stopped. Silence. Ramona let out a slow breath, shoulders slumping. "You're lucky you listened." Callum turned to her, still shaking. "What the hell was that?" She didn't answer, just turned back to her work, as if nothing had happened. Callum looked around, his breath coming fast. Jude was gone. No one else was reacting. Not even Mr. Aldrich. It was as if Jude had never existed at all. And Callum couldn't shake the feeling that something inside that storage room was still watching him. Callum felt it. Even with the door bolted shut, even with the whispering gone, something lingered. The silence wasn't empty. It was aware, like a breath being held just on the other side of the door, waiting. His skin prickled with the weight of it, his stomach twisting. He needed to find Mr. Aldrich. The shift supervisor stood near the inventory desk, motionless as always. The man barely seemed alive, just standing there, eyes fixed on something far beyond the walls, barely even breathing. Callum swallowed down the unease creeping through him and stepped closer. His voice came out quieter than he intended. "What happened to Jude?" Mr. Aldrich's head moved in a slow, deliberate turn until his dead gaze landed on Callum. The skin around his eyes barely shifted, his pupils impossibly dark, swallowing the dim warehouse light. "Who?" Callum blinked. "Jude," he said, more firmly now. "Holloway? The guy that was working with us tonight?" Nothing. No reaction. Just a stare so empty it felt like Callum was speaking into a void. "There's no one by that name here," Mr. Aldrich finally said. His voice was flat, mechanical. Callum felt his stomach drop. That wasn't possible. Jude had been here. They had spoken. He had laughed at the rules. He had walked into the storage room. He had... Callum's thoughts fractured. "Forget him," a low voice muttered beside him. Callum jumped, turning to see Travis Kern, a coworker he barely knew. The man's face was pale, his uniform slightly damp with sweat. His hands shook. He pulled Callum aside, his grip cold and clammy. "If you ask," Travis whispered, "they'll know you noticed." Callum's pulse pounded in his ears. "They?" Travis just shook his head, eyes darting around like something was watching. Before Callum could press further, a noise echoed from deep inside the warehouse. A voice. "Guys, it's cold in here. Help me." Callum's breath hitched. "Jude." Ramona, standing a few feet away, went rigid. The voice had come from inside the meat locker. Callum turned toward the large steel storage room door, the same door he had bolted shut earlier. The whispering had stopped after that. Jude, if it was Jude, had been silent. But now he was calling for help. A part of Callum screamed at him to walk away. Follow the rules, forget him. But another part, the part that wasn't quite ready to let go, made his feet move before he could stop himself. He reached the door, heart hammering. His fingers hovered over the handle. Ramona's whisper cut through the air, sharp and urgent. "Don't." Callum hesitated. But then, a sound from the other side. Not a voice this time. Something shifting, wet. His stomach twisted, like raw meat being dragged across metal. But then, "Callum?" The voice was right there. So close, so familiar. Callum swallowed hard, and against every instinct in his body, he reached out and cracked the door open. A blast of icy air curled around him, burning his skin with unnatural cold. The overhead light inside the storage room flickered erratically, struggling against the darkness that pooled in the corners. Inside, stacks of raw chicken filled the space. Too much. More than Callum had seen earlier. The piles were haphazard, rising like uneven towers, shaped in a way that didn't make sense. The air reeked of something beyond rot, something living. Then, at the center of the room, something moved. A shift in the flesh, a slow, rippling motion beneath the meat. Callum's breath hitched as the pile pulsed, like breathing, like something inside was alive. His fingers dug into the metal doorframe, legs locked in place. His mind screamed at him to run, but his body refused to obey. Then, Jude's face emerged from the raw meat. Not like someone standing up, not like someone digging their way out. His head just surfaced, slowly. His skin slick with something thick and red. His wide, unblinking eyes locked onto Callum. His lips moved, but the voice didn't come from his mouth. It came from deep inside the pile. "Callum, I think I'm stuck." A wave of cold horror crashed over him. His mind tried to rationalize it, tried to force the image into something that made sense. But then, the pile moved again. Twitching, shuddering, something underneath was waking up. The slabs of raw chicken quivered, convulsing like muscle fibers tightening. Jude's face, his face, but not really his, began to sink back down, the meat swallowing him whole. His eyes never closed. They never stopped staring. His mouth opened, but this time there was no sound. Just a hollow, endless gape as his face disappeared into the shifting pile of flesh. Callum's body finally obeyed his instincts. He slammed the door shut and threw the bolt into place. His breath came in ragged, uneven gasps. Ramona was already there, standing just behind him. Her voice was barely a whisper. That's not Jude anymore. Ramona's whisper clung to the air, cold and final. But Callum couldn't move. His fingers were still pressed against the bolted door, the memory of what he'd just seen burning behind his eyes. The pile of meat shifting, breathing, swallowing Jude's face like it had never belonged to him in the first place. Then, from behind the door, a single wet thud, something heavy hitting the metal from the inside. Callum stumbled back. He expected another voice, another whisper, a plea. But there was nothing. Just silence. A silence that felt like it was waiting for him to make the next move. Then, a noise broke through. Not from the storage room. From outside. A deep, guttural growl of an engine rolling up to the back entrance. A semi-truck. Callum's breath hitched as he glanced toward the clock. 3 a.m. The deliveries weren't scheduled until 4:30. The truck's headlights pierced through the fogged-up glass doors, beaming too bright, too white. The sound of the brakes hissing sent an unnatural shiver through him, like the whole warehouse itself tensed at the arrival. Ramona grabbed his wrist. Her fingers were ice cold. "We unloaded," she whispered. "No questions, no hesitation." Callum followed her toward the loading dock, his mind still fractured, trying to process what had just happened in the storage room. But as the truck's cabin door creaked open, a new wave of unease crawled up his spine. The driver stepped out, Deacon Shaw. Callum recognized him. He'd done plenty of night deliveries before. But something was wrong. His uniform was too clean. Not just neat, pristine. No dust, no wrinkles. Not even a crease in the fabric. His name tag gleamed under the flickering dock lights like it had never been touched by human hands. Then Callum noticed the workers in the back of the truck, and his stomach turned to stone. They weren't normal. At first glance, they moved like people. But the longer Callum watched, the more wrong they became. Their limbs swung a fraction too loosely. Their motions were too smooth, like marionettes guided by invisible strings. Then, Callum saw their faces, or rather, the absence of them. No eyes, no nose, no mouth. Just smooth, featureless skin stretched too tightly over their skulls. His entire body locked in place. Ramona stiffened beside him. She didn't look at them. Her voice barely reached him. "Don't look at them. Just unload the truck." Callum's pulse pounded so hard he thought his ribs might crack. The workers moved in eerie synchrony, stepping down from the truck, their faceless heads tilting slightly, as if listening. They made no sound, no breath, no grunt of effort as they lifted the heavy crates. Callum focused on the task: grab a box, move it inside. Do not speak, do not hesitate, do not notice them. But then, he slipped. Just for a second. His gaze flickered, and he made the mistake of looking directly into the blank face of one of the workers. It stopped. The air around them changed, tightened. The thing tilted its head. A slow, unnatural motion, as if it had only just become aware of him. A low humming noise filled Callum's ears, deep and reverberating, like sound traveling through water. His vision blurred. His limbs felt wrong, like they weren't fully his. The thing stepped toward him. Callum couldn't move. The humming grew louder, pushing into his skull, crawling through his bones. The worker's head twitched as if adjusting. Its hand, if it could even be called that, began to stretch toward him, the fingers elongating unnaturally, rubbery and boneless, reaching for his face. Then, a voice, rasping right into his ear. "Deacon Shaw." Only, it didn't sound like him. His lips barely moved, but the voice came out distorted, layered as if too many mouths were speaking at once. They see you now. A sharp yank. Ramona's hand closed around Callum's wrist, jerking him backward. His balance snapped, and the air rushed back into his lungs. The humming stopped. Callum staggered, heart hammering as he gasped in air that felt too thick, too heavy. The faceless worker stood motionless, head still tilted, watching, or listening. Ramona's grip tightened. Move. Callum obeyed. They carried the last crates inside, hands shaking, legs stiff, forcing themselves not to look at the workers. As the last box was set down, Callum chanced a glance toward Deacon. The driver was already climbing back into his truck. The workers followed, moving in perfect unison, like they had never stopped, like nothing had happened. Callum watched as the truck door slammed shut, the headlights flaring too brightly once again. Then the truck rolled away, silent. No rumbling engine, no mechanical hiss of brakes, just gone. Callum let out a slow, shaking breath. Ramona turned to him. Her face was pale, too pale. "You saw them," she whispered. It wasn't a question. Callum swallowed hard, his throat dry as sandpaper. Ramona's voice dropped lower, barely audible. "They saw you too." Ramona's whisper crawled under Callum's skin, burrowing deep. His stomach churned, his body still buzzing with the unnatural hum that had filled his skull moments ago. He wanted to tell himself it was over, that the truck was gone, that the faceless things were gone. But the weight in the air said otherwise. Then the lights flickered. Not just a brief flicker, a deep, shuddering pulse that made the whole warehouse feel like it had just taken a breath. The overhead fluorescents buzzed louder, their glow thinning, stretching shadows across the concrete. Then came the sound, a long, slow scrape. Metal against concrete, dragging from the back of the storage room. Callum stiffened. His heartbeat felt like a fist slamming against his ribs. He turned, catching Travis Kern standing a few feet away, his face pale, his hands shaking just like before. "You heard that, right?" Callum muttered. Travis nodded, but his eyes didn't move from the dark stretch of the storage area. "You think I didn't?" Before either of them could say more, Mr. Aldrich's voice crackled through the intercom, flat and empty. "Inventory check now. Callum, Travis, you're on meat storage." Callum's mouth went dry. No, not there. Not where he'd seen Jude's face emerging from the raw flesh, whispering from somewhere deep inside it. Not where the air felt wrong, thick, pressing. Travis swallowed hard, shaking his head. "I'm not going in there, man, not after what you told me about Jude." But Aldrich's voice returned, sharper. "Now." Travis clenched his jaw, looking at Callum with something close to desperation. "If I don't go, they'll know I noticed." Callum had no argument. He just kept his breath steady as they stepped into the storage room. The moment the door swung shut behind them, the air changed. Colder, heavier. The stacks of raw meat loomed around them, the scent of blood and frost thick in the air. Callum's stomach twisted as his eyes flicked to the pile where he'd last seen Jude. It was gone. Nothing there but a smear of something dark and wet. Then another sound. Not scraping this time. Clicking. Callum froze. It was faint, like teeth snapping together. A slow, deliberate rhythm that sent an electric shiver down his spine. Travis turned toward the far end of the room where the shelves dipped into deeper shadow. "There's something back there," he whispered. Callum wanted to tell him to shut up, that whatever was in here already knew they were there, and whispering wouldn't change a damn thing. But before he could say a word, something moved. Not a normal movement. Not the shifting of crates or the swaying of a loose plastic curtain. This was wrong. A shadow peeled itself from the corner of the room. At first, Callum thought it was human. Tall, impossibly thin. But as it moved, its joints bent the wrong way, knees twisting, arms unfolding unnaturally long. Then he saw its face. Or what should have been its face. The skin was stretched too tight over its skull, the eye sockets hollow and sunken. Its mouth was the worst part, hanging slightly open, revealing teeth that clicked together in that awful, deliberate rhythm. Callum's body locked up. Travis breathed too loud. The creature's head snapped toward him. The clicking sound accelerated, faster, sharper. Then it moved. Not a step, a lurch, like its body had skipped ahead without crossing the space in between. Travis let out a choked noise. His entire body trembled. He took a step back, just one. It was enough. The lurker lunged. Its skeletal arms stretched unnaturally as it yanked Travis into the dark. Callum barely had time to react. Travis's scream started human. Then it warped. It twisted into something wet and garbled, like his throat had collapsed in on itself. Then silence. Only the sound of teeth clicking faster and faster, fading into the shadows. Callum took a shaky step back. His breath felt trapped in his chest. Then the lights flickered again. A low, shuddering exhale filled the room. Not his, not Travis's. Something else. Still in here. Callum stood frozen, his breath locked in his throat. The air inside the storage room felt too thick, too aware. He could feel it watching him, the weight of its presence pressing into his skin. His muscles ached to run, but he didn't know where to go. The only door was the one he'd come through, and the darkness between him and that exit felt impossibly vast. Then a voice. Soft. Measured. Whatever happens, don't move when the clock hits 3:12 a.m. Ramona. Callum turned his head sharply, his body still humming with the terror of what he had just witnessed. Travis was gone, dragged into that suffocating blackness by something that moved in ways no living thing should. Callum wanted to grab Ramona, shake her, demand answers, but the look in her eyes stopped him. She wasn't just warning him, she was pleading. He swallowed hard, his throat dry and raw. What happens at 3:12? Ramona didn't blink. Just don't move. Callum glanced at the clock above the break room door. 3:11 a.m. 1 minute. He hadn't noticed before, but the warehouse was too quiet. No hum of refrigerators, no distant chatter from other employees, not even the faint sound of wind against the loading docks. The world felt like it was holding its breath. Then the air pressed down. Callum's ears popped, his lungs struggling to expand. The lights overhead didn't flicker this time, they changed. A deep, suffocating red flooded the room. It wasn't normal light. It moved like liquid, pooling in corners, stretching shadows unnaturally tall. Callum felt his knees lock, his body screaming to bolt, to fight, to do something. Then, footsteps. Slow, deliberate. Something stepped out from the far side of the warehouse, moving toward him with an eerie calm. The moment Callum saw its face, his blood turned to ice. It was Jude, or at least it was wearing Jude's face. The features were the same slouched posture, the same uniform, but something was horribly, impossibly wrong. Jude's smile was stretched too wide. His lips curled at the edges, pulled beyond what human skin should allow. His teeth, there were too many. And his eyes, black, bottomless. A void where something hungry stirred. Callum's fingers twitched, his instinct screaming to step back, to run, to fight, to do anything except stand there. Then Jude's mouth moved. The voice that came out was soft, familiar, but layered with something else, something deeper. Callum, his name slithered from Jude's lips, stretching like it was being pulled apart. Callum's stomach twisted, his heartbeat a frantic drum in his ears. Jude, or the thing wearing Jude, tilted its head. The smile didn't change. I think it's your turn now. Callum wanted to move. His legs trembled, his fingers twitched, his breath came in sharp, panicked gasps. But Ramona's warning rang in his skull like a siren. Don't move. He clenched his jaw so hard it hurt. His entire body was screaming in protest. The thing that looked like Jude took another step forward, the red light writhing around him. The shadows behind him stretched, reaching toward Callum like grasping hands. Still, he didn't move. The air buzzed, thick with something electric and alive. The walls seemed to shrink. Jude's smile widened. One more step, so close now that Callum could see the skin at the edges of his mouth cracking. Splitting. His voice dropped to a whisper. You're not breathing, Callum. Callum bit down on his tongue to keep himself still. The shadows crawled closer. The red light pulsed like a living thing wrapped around his body. Then, everything snapped back. The red light was gone. The pressure in the air vanished. The hum of the refrigerators returned, the distant sounds of footsteps in the warehouse filling the space like nothing had happened. Jude, or whatever had been standing in front of him, was gone. Callum gasped for air. His lungs burned, his body shaking violently. He stumbled back, nearly collapsing, but Ramona caught his arm. She was pale, terrified. You saw him, she whispered. Callum nodded. Ramona swallowed hard. That means you don't have much time. Callum's breath was still uneven, his body trembling as Ramona's words echoed in his head. You don't have much time. The air around him still felt wrong, as if the red light had seeped into his bones, leaving a residue of something that wasn't finished with him yet. His stomach twisted, his skin prickling with the sensation of being watched. Not just by Ramona, but by thing unseen, something waiting. Then, he heard it. A voice. Faint at first, barely more than a whisper, slipping through the cold air of the storage room behind him. It sent a sharp electric chill down his spine. "Callum!" His body locked up. The voice was his. It called again, clearer this time, curling around him like a hand gripping his throat. "Callum, come here." Slowly, stiffly, he turned his head toward the storage room door. It was closed. Hadn't it always been closed? But the voice, it was coming from inside. His pulse pounded in his ears. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. Yet, as if drawn by invisible strings, his hand moved to the handle. He didn't want to open it. He had to open it. The door swung inward with a groan, revealing the dimly lit storage room. Rows of hanging meat swayed gently, though there was no breeze. The fluorescent light flickered once, twice, then stabilized. And there, standing among the slabs of raw, glistening flesh, was him. Callum staggered back. The figure in the storage room was him in every way. Same uniform, same exhausted expression, same strands of dark hair falling over his forehead. But the way it stood, too still, too deliberate, like it was waiting for him to understand what he was looking at. Then, it smiled. Callum's stomach plummeted. The expression on its face was wrong, too wide, too knowing. The smile stretched past what lips should allow, the skin around it taut and unnatural. And then it stepped forward. Callum's legs refused to move, his body locking up as his double leaned in slightly, tilting its head. The movement was eerily smooth, fluid, like the joints weren't quite human. The other Callum's voice came in a whisper, soft but crawling under his skin like centipede legs. "You don't belong out there anymore." Callum's chest seized. The thing's smile widened further. "I do." Callum slammed the door shut. A second of silence. Then something pounded against the other side. Hard. The door shook violently, the force behind it unnatural, relentless. Callum staggered back as the sound became worse, a wet, fleshy pounding, like raw meat being slammed against metal. The doorknob rattled. The hinges groaned. Then, a voice. Muffled, distorted through the door. "Callum, let me out." The pounding stopped. His breath came in sharp, ragged gasps. The silence was worse than the noise. A shudder crawled down his spine as a new sound filled the air, a whispering. It started low, soft. It wasn't coming from the other Callum, it was coming from the meat. The hanging slabs of raw flesh shifted slightly, as if something inside them was moving. Then they began to whisper. Dozens of voices, hundreds, layered over each other, all speaking at once, but none of them understandable. Callum stumbled backward, his skin crawling as the whispers grew louder. The air felt thick, heavy, clogged with words he couldn't decipher but could feel sinking into his skin. Then the whispering stopped. A breath, not his, brushed against his ear. "You've lasted longer than I expected." Callum whipped around. Mr. Aldrich stood inches behind him. Too close. His face was neutral, his small round glasses reflecting the harsh fluorescent light. But his eyes, there was something behind them. Something that knew. Callum couldn't breathe. Mr. Aldrich's eyes, cold and unreadable, pinned him in place. The air between them felt wrong, like the very space they occupied was bending, stretching into something unnatural. Callum's body screamed at him to move, to run, to get out, but his feet remained rooted to the floor, his pulse hammering against his ribs like a trapped animal. The whispers from the meat had stopped, but the silence was worse. It was waiting. Callum forced himself to speak, his voice hoarse and shaking. "What the hell is going on?" Mr. Aldrich sighed, as if he'd been asked the same question 100 times before. Maybe he had. He adjusted his glasses, the dim storage room light reflecting off the lenses, hiding his eyes for a split second before he spoke. "One last rule," he said, voice even, emotionless. "You can't leave unless someone takes your place." The words settled in Callum's stomach like a stone, heavy and suffocating. "You can't leave." The meaning sank in, slow and suffocating. His thoughts scrambled, connecting pieces that he didn't want to fit. Ramona, Travis, Jude. They had all been new hires once, just like him. Callum's breath hitched as he turned, scanning the store with frantic eyes. How long had they been here? Had they tried to leave? Had they been trapped just like him, waiting for the next poor soul to walk through the door? No. The words slipped from his lips before he realized he'd said it. "No, I'm not staying here. I didn't sign up for this." Mr. Aldrich's expression didn't change. He only blinked, slow and patient. Neither did they. Something snapped inside Callum. He ran. His legs burned as he sprinted down the narrow aisles, past the flickering fluorescent lights, past the silent rows of shelves that seemed to stretch longer than they should. The air thickened around him, as if the store itself was pushing against him, resisting his escape. But the exit, he could see it. The glass doors loomed ahead, the outside world beyond them shrouded in darkness. He nearly crashed into them. The doors didn't open. A cold, sinking dread clawed at his chest as he slammed his fists against the glass. It didn't budge. Then, a shadow shifted outside. A figure stepped forward. Deacon Shaw. His uniform was too clean, his eyes, shadowed beneath the brim of his hat, locked onto Callum like he'd been expecting him. And behind him, Callum's stomach twisted. The faceless men. They stood in perfect formation, shoulder to shoulder, grinning without mouths. Their featureless faces seemed to stretch and ripple as if their skin wasn't entirely solid. Callum stumbled back. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. But as he turned, Ramona was gone. Mr. Aldrich was still there, standing where Callum had left him, as calm as ever. He held out something toward him, a clipboard. Callum's hands trembled. Mr. Aldrich smiled. Not cruel, not kind, just inevitable. Welcome to management.